Presentation.
Hi, I'm John Delano, political editor for KDK TV, CBS Pittsburgh. And our special guest today is attorney Matt Haverstick, who is the lawyer representing the state Senate candidate Nicole Ziccarelli, and frankly is a Philadelphia attorney who's quite expert on election law in Pennsylvania. Thank you, sir, very much for being with me, Matt. I appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
So let me ask you first, Judge Joe James here in Allegheny County has just come down with his opinion, his decision,
Right.
and basically is dismissing the objections that you filed to counting certain ballots in Allegheny County. What's your reaction to his decision?
Well, we don't agree with it. We think that we have the better of the argument, of course, and not the least of which, because 2 months ago, our state Supreme Court ruled on essentially these very issues, and I think pretty strongly suggested that we were right and those votes shouldn't be counted. But we're going to appeal. We think we'll end up on the right side of it at the end.
It's a little confusing to me. I want to try to understand the case a little better, because
Sure.
you essentially were arguing that with respect to mail-in ballots, that signatures, dating, I mean, some of the rules that are required need to be followed to the T, or your ballot is rejected. Am I stating that correctly?
That's right. There are a couple of core things that the legislature on the mail-in ballot required to be there, and they're there for good reasons. They're there to protect the system overall from fraud and mistake. It requires a signature and it requires a date. And we think the General Assembly thinks and meant that those requirements are not negotiable. They're not waivable. Your vote and ballot just doesn't count if you don't do those basic things. And that was the core of our argument.
Judge James says that if there's no suggestion of fraud, then you should not disqualify otherwise lawful ballots. You disagree?
Well, I do. I think there are some rules that the General Assembly has made clear are mandatory, and the signature and the dating are one of them. And the reason for that is to make sure that the system overall is protected and protectable, because a date can matter if you're trying to decide whether the person was a qualified elector on the date that the mail-in ballot was filled out. So I understand and respect Judge James's view on it. I just don't happen to think he's right on this one. And I think at the end, we're really going to end up in our state Supreme Court. I think our state Supreme Court's going to agree with us on it.
Yeah, let me be clear about that. You are appealing this to the next level, which I guess would really be Commonwealth Court. But I saw that the state Supreme Court is taking a case from Philadelphia that's similar.
Right. So it gets a little convoluted. Normally we did appeal to Commonwealth Court, which is a sort of government appellate court or appeals court for government issues. But because the same issue already is bubbled up from Philadelphia County, and the state Supreme Court has taken that issue sort of out of turn and it's going to decide it, we think we're going to get wrapped up one way or another, either directly or indirectly, in the state court proceeding. We're actually going to file our own, and we may have filed it already, our own effort to get into state court on the Allegheny County issue. And I expect that what will happen is our King's Bench, that's our Supreme Court filing, will get amalgamated with the other Supreme Court case, and it'll just become one big Supreme Court case.
Gotcha. Let me ask you, if I may, Matt, as a state election of really expert on the law side, the legal side of this, Congressman Mike Kelly out here in Western Pennsylvania has introduced a bill that he's calling the Election Integrity Act. And essentially it has a number of requirements. I wondered if I could get your opinion simply on some of these provisions. One of which is that mail-in ballots ought to be counted when received. Now, the results wouldn't be made public until after the polls had closed. But in order to avoid this lengthy post-election counting process, that ballots, as in states like Florida, should be started to be counted earlier. What's your view on that kind of a provision?
I think something like that deserves a really hard look. I mean, understand we're in Pennsylvania, really this election kicking the tires on a a broad use of the mail-in ballot. And I can tell you from personal experience in some of the races we've seen, and from watching you and reading the newspaper, other problems are cropping up all over the state. I don't think it means that anyone intended to do anything wrong. It's just a brand new system, and there's some issues that we see as we go through it the first time. And one of them is this slowdown in getting things counted. I think that there's some room for coming up with a way to begin canvassing some of these mail-in ballots prior to election day, as long as we preserve the ability to make sure that there's a way to weed out the invalid ones, either at the front end or after election day. It's important. Again, we saw that with all these mail-in ballots, a lot of people made mistakes. There were some errors made. People send in ballots from districts in which they no longer live, things like that. So I think there's room for some improvements that could go along with perhaps an earlier tally.
Well, one of his proposals is that there be a camera, a video recording of the whole processing of these ballots from beginning to end. Do you think that's a good approach?
I think that ought to be looked at too. I was in Allegheny County for some of the counting after election day, and in some counties you get really good access, and you can see what's going on. Westmoreland's like that, I think. In other counties, because of the geometry or the geography of the room, it's hard to see. It's hard to see some of these things. I think if nothing else, an idea like that would serve to give the public confidence that there's really nothing wrong going on, which I think by and large is how our elections are conducted. There really isn't anything nefarious happening, but it's good for people to be able to see it for themselves.
Are there other suggestions either in the Kelly bill or that you would generally recommend would be good improvements in our election process?
I think that we should make a really sincere effort to, on the one hand, protect against fraud because it's not non-existent. On the other hand, to not turn it into a cipher issue or a means to try to delegitimize elections. In my observation, there's no such thing as a perfect election. What you really want to aim for is an election that's good enough for us as Americans to be able to trust it. And that means we have to do some things like perhaps being more vigilant about matching signatures when we're going to do more mail-in ballots. But it also means that we should have confidence that overall our elections are really fair.
Yeah, I think fairness is the key. People want to feel that their vote counted and that everyone's vote counted, and we got a result that was fair.
Right.
In the end, when it comes to all these lawsuits in Pennsylvania this year, do you think that has really sort of delegitimized the election process in Pennsylvania? Can we get over this?
I think we can get over it. I look, everyone has a right, if you're in the electoral process, whether you're a candidate or whether you're a voter, to stand up and challenge if you honestly think there's a problem. And we saw in this election, despite a lot of the hype, that there were some real problems in it. I don't suggest that people were doing things maliciously or on purpose to do the wrong thing. But again, with the brand new system of this mail-in ballot process, there were things that we didn't get right. And I think everybody is entitled to stand up and say, hey, look, I don't think that was done right, and I want to take it to court. So I don't want to overblow the effect litigation has had on our electoral process. Frankly, it's a little less than I thought. But at the same time, look, there comes a point where, and I think we're getting to it right now, where we all want to have a conclusion and we all want an outcome. And I think the litigation is sort of working itself out the way it's meant to.
Well, again, Matt Haverstick, an election attorney from Philadelphia. Thank you, sir, very much for taking time with me. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.
Hi, I'm John Delano, political editor, KDK TV, and we are with Vic Walczak, the ACLU of Pennsylvania's legal director extraordinaire. Vic, thank you, sir, very much for being with me. I appreciate this.
Thanks, John. Checks in the mail. Yeah, keep it up.
Let me ask you about a couple different things. You know of the Pennsylvania election law backwards and forwards. You've been involved in a number of these cases, not just this year, but over the years. And I think it gets a little hard to understand for the average person out there when it comes to casting a ballot. Now, most people in normal times just go to the voting place and vote. And there's never any question about it. I mean, I suppose the poll workers might say to you, well, we don't have your registration. That might happen from time to time. But normally you just vote and your vote gets counted and you go home and everybody's happy. But this year, there seems to be so many lawsuits and so many complaints. And we're learning that there's so many little fine points that particularly affect mail-in ballot. What's going on here?
Yeah, so there's two things that have happened to generate a huge amount of interest in mail balloting. The first is that last November, before the pandemic, the General Assembly passed Act 77. It was the first substantial amendment of the election code in decades. And one of the things they did was they add what's called no excuse absentee voting. So it used to be that you could only vote if you had a doctor's note, if you had a disability, or if you declared under oath that you were going to be unavailable in the precinct to vote on election day. That was changed in a bipartisan vote, both Republicans and Democrats, to allow people to vote by mail without any excuse. And this is really what's done in the vast majority of states. I mean, it's common sense. It makes it a lot easier for people. There are no concerns about any kind of fraud going on here. It is perfectly safe and makes voting more accessible. The second big thing that happened is obviously COVID struck in March, right? So there are a lot of people who are afraid to go into any kind of congested space and interact with other people. And a lot of people have good reason for that fear just because either of their age or certain comorbidities, they are much more likely to get sick and die if they contract the virus. Those two things came together to dramatically increase the number of people who voted by mail in the primary in June, and that nearly doubled for the general election in November. So, that's why we had nearly 3 million people voting by mail.
So let me ask you then about some of these so-called fatal flaws or things that you could do wrong that might affect whether your ballot gets counted or not. And we'll talk about mail-in ballots and then there are provisional ballots as well. But the mail-in ballots, for example, in the Nicole Ziccarelli case, she challenged, I believe, some 2,300 votes in Allegheny County, mail-in ballots, because people did not assign the date on which they cast their vote, even though the vote was received in mail by the election day, November 3rd. Judge Joe James just ruled a few minutes ago that these votes should be counted. What's your understanding about those kinds of rules that apply? When do they disqualify a vote and when do they not?
Right. So voting by mail is more complicated than voting in person, as you suggested. It shouldn't be that way. Unfortunately, it is. Hopefully, over time, Pennsylvania will be able to streamline that process. The legislature in passing Act 77 was not crystal clear. So there are some ambiguities and some vagueness in the language. And what they said is that you have to have a signature on the ballot. There's no question about that, right? There has to be a signature on there. What that signature does is basically say that if you cast a fraudulent ballot, that you can be prosecuted for that. You're saying that, no, this is me, I'm an eligible voter. So if you intentionally violate that, you're in trouble. You could do 5 years in jail. Beside that, the statute simply says that the declaration has to be sufficient. That has not been fully explained in the legislation. We've argued in court that the only thing that's necessary is the signature. The date is going to be on the receipt when it comes into the Board of Elections. They not only stamp and date the day it was received, but they scan a barcode in so that it gets uploaded to the Secretary of State's office. So the only critical date is that it came in before the election day, or now the Supreme Court gave us 3 extra days for that. The other things that are on there are not at all necessary. So, and beyond that, the Pennsylvania Constitution has protections for voters' rights beyond anything in the U.S. Constitution. So the U.S. Constitution is a floor. States in their own constitutions can provide more rights for individuals. Pennsylvania, long ago, decided to do that. There's something called the Free and Equal Elections Clause. And for decades, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has ruled that if there is any uncertainty about whether a ballot should count, the tie goes to the voter. And it's really only if you've got clear evidence that the voter is somehow ineligible or that there was fraud involved, that ballot should count. Judge James today, in his opinion, got it exactly right, said there is not even an allegation that these 2,300 voters are improper. Clearly, these ballots arrived on time, and there is absolutely no reason they shouldn't be counted. In fact, I mean, if you don't count them, that means you are canceling the votes of 2,300 eligible voters. Talk about a massive civil liberties violation. If the Trump campaign and these other challengers got their way, then you would have massive disenfranchisement of eligible voters all across the Commonwealth.
And that would also apply, presumably, for some of the requirements on provisional voting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, a number of signatures you have to put in there and fill in certain places. And, and one way to think about the Trump campaign's challenge in federal court, where I just came back from this morning, is that their claim is that in some counties, they gave help to these mail voters to help them understand exactly where you sign, where you date, what you do. And in other counties, you didn't. And so some of those folks lost their votes. If you go in and vote provisionally, if it's not busy, and depending on the poll workers, they may stand there and help you and say, oh, no, you don't sign there. You need to sign here, or you got to do that. It really varies. But the cure for this cannot possibly be that eligible voters' ballots are being canceled. And it is really infuriating me to hear the Trump campaign and followers say, no, you should only count legal votes. There is no allegation that any of these votes are illegal, that these are ineligible voters. And yet what they're asking the court to do is to invalidate hundreds of thousands of legal votes.
Let me ask you finally, Vic, then about a bill that was introduced by Congressman Mike Kelly called the Election Integrity Bill. It has a number of provisions, one of which would require the counties, at least in Pennsylvania and across the nation, to start counting mail-in ballots when received, rather than waiting, as Pennsylvania does, until Election Day, which inevitably means a lengthy period of vote counting. There are other provisions as well. I'll ask you about those in a second. But what do you think about counting mail-in ballots as soon as they're received by election officials?
So there's a reason that 3 key states did not have their elections called on election night: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And the reason is that the legislatures in all 3 states, which are all controlled by Republicans, refused to change the law to allow the counties to start counting ballots earlier. That's what's done in states all across the country. There's a reason that Florida, which is bigger than Pennsylvania was called on election night because they count as those ballots come in. There is no fraud or security related basis to delay the count of those ballots. And it was because the Republican Party refused to change those rules. So it's a little bit rich for Congressman Kelly, who's been part of a number of these lawsuits with the Trump campaign, trying to make vote by mail more difficult and more complicated, to now say, oh, they should count earlier. Yes, we absolutely agree. This should have been done several weeks ago. If they want to do it going forward, please, please do that. We know the county boards of elections were begging for this change. So that is actually a very good change.
What about his recommendation of putting into statute that there'd be cameras on the whole process of opening up, processing, counting ballots?
I'm sorry, John.
Should there be cameras?
Yeah. So a lot of what is in Congressman Kelly's bill are things that they asked for in the federal lawsuit that they filed out here in Pittsburgh over the summer, and they lost all of those things. Look, I mean, security is a good thing. Whether you need it inside the canvassing places, I don't know. Look, if you got the money and you want to spend it and you feel like it's important, I don't think it's a big deal. But one of the concerns I have is that all of these proposals actually raise, I think, doubts in people's mind about the security of the election. And you've had the Department of Homeland Security top election official and county elections boards all across the country come out and say this was the most secure and problem-free election that we've had in a very long time. And so people should be assured that these elections worked pretty well. I mean, if there are problems, it may be that a handful of people whose votes should have counted were not counted for various reasons. There is zero evidence of any kind of massive disenfranchisement or fraud. And what's really important for people to understand is that even Rudy Giuliani in court yesterday, I was one of less than 50 people in that courtroom. Even Rudy Giuliani admitted, after going on a rant about all this fraud that's going on, that they had not properly pled fraud in the lawsuit that's being filed there. I expect that the judge will refer to that when he eventually issues his opinion, which should come either Friday afternoon or Saturday.
Final question to Vic Walczak, the legal director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania. Is there any issue with Congressman Kelly trying to do something federally when elections are normally handled on a state and county basis?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on what's called sort of federalism concerns. You are right that elections are by and large run by states, and in many places like Pennsylvania, the real authority is kind of delegated to the county level, which is why you have all sorts of differences. I mean, I think that Congressman Kelly is going to get a lot of pushback for that. But you know, I don't have strong feelings in particular about that. So yeah, sorry.
That's fine. You don't have to have on everything I ask you. So, well, hey, it's a great pleasure to be with you, Vic. Vic,
yeah, likewise.
Thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, John.
This has been a CBSN Pittsburgh special presentation. We now return to our scheduled programming in progress.
It's time to fight. Oh my God, oh my God. Oh dear God.